Hello.
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 Hello. Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. I'll be tonight's host. I have with me tonight Dan Lanzolata. Dan is an executive chef, and we're going to be probably talking about nutrition and food and hot cuisine and regular peasant food and nutrition and a whole bunch of other stuff. First of all, I want you to introduce yourself to the audience.
Daniel Lanzolata. I'm the owner-operator of The Mindful Chef. I'm a chef educator in the Westport and Wilton Continuing Education Program. I was on hiatus over the winter. I spent the winter in France shooting food videos.
And there's more. Come on. Tell more.
Well, I live in Westport. I partially live in the southwest of France in Biarritz. And I'm a graduate of Carnegie Mellon University, the New York Restaurant School. I am very active in the town of Westport. I'm a member of the Green Village Initiative in Westport, which is a private organization that's bringing lots of wonderful things to Westport and making Westport a greener community. We got rid of the plastic bag. We have a plastic bag ordinance now in Westport. We're going to try to bring gardens to each school in Westport eventually.
What in the world is the plastic bag ordinance?
Well, that's to get rid of the excessive use of plastic bags and having people use sustainable products and like cotton.
Yeah.
Bringing your own bag to the store, which I always forget for some reason.
Now, you mentioned the community gardens in the schools.
Right.
Now, I'm going to beckon back, because I have to kind of delve back into 6 years ago now, because I had a friend, Tricia Taylor, who lives in Westport, and there was a garden going in at Long Lot School. And the problem with that garden, as she saw it, and as a gentleman by the name of Dave Brown, who testified at Town Hall, saw it, was that the garden had been used principally as a nursery, principally to raise roses, and because of that, around the perimeter of the garden, you had, what do they kill rats with?
Poison.
Okay, there you go, exactly. Let's get technical for a second here. And I guess their contention was that it wasn't an appropriate place. Did you come across any of that? Is this familiar to you at all? Or
it sounds like the community garden that's there now.
Yeah.
That's a very active garden, which is not part of, it's more community-oriented. The gardens that I've been involved with are educational gardens, and we brought the first edible school garden to Staples High School last year.
Excellent.
So we're in our second season, which is very active at the moment.
What educational benefit do these gardens have for the students? Not just the nutritious benefit, obviously, the nutritional benefit, but what about educational benefit? What are the kids learning about these gardens?
I think they get a sensibility about where their food's coming from. For the most part, we've been detached from the idea of our food chain. So, in other words, if you're going out to eat, you're going out to buy a product. You're not going out to buy something that someone took the time and effort to grow. You get to know perhaps the way things are tended to. You learn about care. A garden is really a microcosm of just about everything. You learn about soil. You learn about essentially death, what soil is. It's organic matter that's died and giving life again. So there's metaphor. Gardens have been represented in literature, religion. It's really a place to start a great education because it touches upon everything. It touches upon physics. It touches upon geology, biology. It touches every science practically that I can think of, and people have to get back to a notion of where are we, what are we, and how are we made, because we are essentially part of that chain. We will become that dirt, and people do not have a sensibility anymore, in my opinion, about where they are, what they're about, where they're going, and how it ends up, because there's a denial system built into the culture that suppresses us and forces us to think of ourselves like we're here forever. It's a selfish concept. And the idea of longevity, about this idea that I can prolong my life by eating certain supplements, and I can prolong my life by having discretionary dollars. So we've become accustomed to this idea that if we have money, we can prolong our lives. And this is a very dangerous concept to me, this idea. You mentioned about all the interest I have about food. And I believe, from my own perspective, that whatever the topic is, it's always going to come back to the food.
Yeah.
And
I guess that's what life is all about, other than oxygen and water. I guess that's
right.
Next in line for what's most important to us.
Right. So in this culture, because it's a very young culture, even the first people, I mean, when Europeans came to America, they were going to starve. So it came back to the food. And the first people who were here, the native people, were kind enough to actually show the Europeans what to do. And they survived. We know the history. And that's an interesting concept, to think about the food aspect of it. Otherwise, if they didn't eat and survive, we wouldn't have an America, would we? And so we've kind of cast that aside, that whole idea. We don't talk about it. It only comes up in topic around Thanksgiving, but we don't even have that story right. That story needs to be corrected. And until we have a healing in America, we will never get where we have to go.
Before we go on to Thanksgiving, because I want to hear more about Thanksgiving and about the narrative and what you see as being a little bit askew about the truth of the matter, the audience might have noticed you have a little bit of what we would call in Connecticut, we would call an accent.
I do.
That Bronx accent, the Bronx.
Well, I would like to think of it more of as a color accent,
Okay.
from a designerly point of view.
Okay. Now, you mentioned before we went on about growing up in the Bronx, and something that people, even here in Connecticut, don't really think of as being part of living in a city relative to the food. Tell me about that.
Well, growing up in the Bronx, where I grew up in the northeast Bronx, where Westchester County meets the city line between Mount Vernon and Yonkers. And the Bronx essentially was a farm. It was a gentleman's farm. And at that time, when my grandmother came from Italy after the Depression, she literally bought a house, and she had a chunk of land in the Bronx. She made everything: wine, anisette, beer, canning, growing food on the property in the Bronx. And then they moved, they sold that house, and they bought the house I grew up in with my grandparents. And she continued on, made vinegar, canned. I mean, this woman essentially was her self-sufficient. She was a pioneer. And that, I would say the backyard was maybe 25 feet by 30 feet, something like that.
Which is pretty modest, I guess.
Very modest.
About 700 square feet.
She grew everything. We even attempted corn one year, but that wasn't very successful. So we had a peach tree, pear tree, cherry tree, apple tree, tomato, I mean everything, an herb garden. And this was used throughout the year. She was able to produce enough stuff to either can it, eat it as it was being grown. So I'd like to say to people that I grew up on on a farm in the Bronx. So that notion kind of confuses people. I didn't have to grow up on a farm. I got an education from my grandparents, from my mother, from my father, that gave me core values that I still have today. And I think we are so disconnected in so many ways that because of the idea of you can always get another one, it's down to the point where it's about relationships. And I had mentioned this to you earlier.
Sure, yeah.
It's about food, but it's really more about relationships. And we have forgotten how to have a relationship with anything. There are certain cultures in Asia, in Africa, throughout the world, even in parts of Europe, where objects aren't just objects. It was honed, it was crafted, it was made, it was a one of a kind. And America used to have that. We have our own American crafts. And we've kind of drifted away from that. I think it's coming back now. And for me, it's very sad to know that the Brookfield Arts Center went bankrupt.
Yeah.
That was a craft center. How could we allow artists to be put to the side during an economic crisis? They live, they eat, they have to have a means of work and support. And we've forgotten them. Yet we've bailed out certain aspects of the culture, and look what we've created. But the artists and those kinds of people who are creating pots and different types of arts and crafts have been left to the side, which gets back to this idea of self-reliance. My grandmother was self-reliant for the most part. She grew her food, she fixed everything, she sewed, and I grew up in that atmosphere. So I think that as Americans, where we've been raised in the mythology of the pioneer, taking care of yourself, we have surrendered ourselves, and we have abandoned the very core of our psyche and who we are. And I think we're paying the price for it now. We've offshored everything to every other country on the planet, and yet we want to consume everything on the planet. I don't think you can do both.
To be a consumer and a consumer nation and a nation of wealth, I guess?
Well, I went to college at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. So one day at that time, Toyota was the big thing. And we were offshoring our steel to Japan. So I decided I was going to take a ride out to Homestead, to where the steel mills are, just for curiosity. And I was pretty shocked by what I saw.
What did you see?
I saw a ghost town. I saw mills closed down. I saw people that were pretty broken. And we are in the same spot from the time I was in college. That was 20-something years ago. And yet we still haven't learned the lessons to figure out how to correct what we've invented. We've invented the idea of manufacturing. We invented the idea of mass-producing products. We used to produce the machines that made the machines. We were great engineers, and we were great visionaries, but we've given that to some other parts of the world for various reasons to be what? Consumers. We don't even have services anymore.
I've seen the same thing in Allentown and Bethlehem, again in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure that no matter where you go in any of the older parts of the United States, the older parts of the American part of the United States, you see a lot of the same thing. But areas that used to have manufacturing, used to make things and make things that make other things,
right,
as you say. And they're just not functional anymore. You have these giant buildings in Allentown that are now malls.
Right. So the malls used to be farms. And farms are really factories, except they're producing and growing stuff outside of manufacturing with machinery that's in a building. So if we get back to correcting the farm and correcting and honoring the farmer and giving the farmer the benefit of the doubt, because we really don't treat our farmers with much respect anymore, considering that farming is really run by corporations, where conventional food is subsidized and organic food is not, but the demand for organic food is so big that the conventional people are looking towards the organic profit. So we're jeopardizing the standards of organic by increasing the demand. So there are people out there that are playing with the standards to accommodate the demand. And you can't have both, because it'll just go back to the same old.
What did your grandmother teach you about the old country, about Italy? Did she teach you anything about where she came from, her roots?
I would say that was done through an idea of respect for things, to take care of things, to make things yourself, to find in the object or the process of doing something some kind of joy. And if you can't find the joy in the most basic, simple things, you certainly are not going to find the joy in the most complicated things. I broke up with a girlfriend a long time ago, and I was crying along 287 one day, and I decided, you know what? Just enjoy it. And I did, and it was a lot easier. So I enjoyed the crying. I enjoyed the idea of the pain, in a sense that I released myself from the burden of the pain by allowing it to be part of my life for that time period.
Man, are we birds of a feather or what?
And of course. What we tend to do is we tend to suppress.
Yeah.
And in the suppression, we look for shortcuts. And the shortcut is the pill. And the shortcut is going to the modern shaman, which is the psychiatry. And the psychiatry is tapped into the pharmaceuticals. And the pharmaceuticals are tapped into the big oil. The big oil is tapped into the big military. So you have a chain of events that is snowballing out of control, but no one wants to stand up and say, stop it. And until the day comes where Americans say, we're taking back what is rightfully ours for the people, by the people, and stop professionalizing the political system.
Yeah.
When did you ever hear that someone wanted to be a politician, and that's what they went to school to become a politician, to run for office because it's a job? Being a politician shouldn't be a job.
Yeah, it was more of an avocation.
It should be an avocation, and you should have a job. And Joe the plumber, that mythological figure, should actually be running the country. Not that particular Joe the plumber.
Right, not that Joe the plumber,
but
perhaps.
You understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You know, get it back to the tradespeople. Get it back to the people. I mean, for God's sake. Because as it stands, lobbyists, corporations, and politicians are running the show. And people are driving themselves insane, thinking that people are going to come and help them. When the hurricane hit in Louisiana, and African Americans were on the roofs with signs that said, help, I knew something was really wrong, because they didn't come to get you when it was dry. They're certainly not going to get you when there are floods.
Yeah.
And so if we don't wake up, we're going to be looking at a really bad situation that got worse.
Well, this show is to a great degree about finding solutions. So we need to spend a little bit of time finding solutions to these problems. And I want to take you back to your grandma again, because I sense a lot of who you are evolved from who she was.
Well, my grandparents in general. Yeah. Well, my grandmother was a seamstress that did beading for wedding gowns. Her husband was a marble cutter from a small town in Italy. He did fancy marble work. These were hardworking people. On my mother's side, my grandmother, her mother, was a nutritionist, a dietitian. She spoke several languages. My grandfather, my mother's father, was a fancy plasterer. When you go into the buildings from the 40s and that era, you look up and you see these cornices and all the beautiful plasterwork. That's what he did. Now that's backbreaking, incredibly difficult work. There's something to be said about that. I don't think there were fat people or people that were overweight at the time, because people actually did physical labor. There were no gyms, there were no treadmills, there was no fad to it. And people were fit, people lived their lives, they ate better food, they had a better life, in my opinion. And I think that if you really want to get fit, just get a job that's physical. And break out of the cubicle and live your life, live your dream, and do what you need to do. I work constantly. I'm 50-something years old, and I work hard. I've never been to a gym in my life. So I think that we're seeing the beginnings of something big happening out there in the sustainability movement, where people want to get back to farming, where they want to take permaculture courses. You know, there's a real big boom in it, you know, throughout the country, from East Coast to West Coast. And during the winter, I was in France, and then I came back to the East Coast, and I went to Seattle for a little while. Then I came back to the East Coast and went to Vermont. And I could tell you, on both sides of the country, for the short time that I was visiting both sides of the country, I saw that there is something happening, something's percolating, and there's no way to stop it now. People want to take back their lives, and the best way to take back your life is to do it yourself. But without selfish intention.
I'm seeing that here in Connecticut, too. I've been a lot of places in Connecticut on the political jaunts and seeing people having very low-level funding house parties for grassroots candidates, and it'll be on somebody having a very modest yard, but in that modest yard, they'll have this whole process of self-sustainability. They'll have the chickens, and they'll have goat, and they'll have this, that, and the other that takes care of a lot of their basic nutritional needs. It's marvelous.
It's taking care of a lot more than that, because it's not just about the nutritional value of the food. It's about the psychological value of the food. When you're out in the garden, when you're taking care of something other than yourself, altruism is a magical thing. And when you take care of a child or a pet, you know, when you say my grandmother, I always had a pet. I always had a dog, a turtle, a bird. We always had pets. And I think when you're exposed to, you know, other species, and you're responsible for that other species being fed and watered and walked, there's a certain thing that you're growing up with, a certain respect for the animal. And we need to bring back animal husbandry and let people start to understand where their meat's coming from. I happen to be a vegetarian, but I'm not going to advocate what I do. If you're a meat eater, you just don't have to eat the whole cow.
Right.
You know, we have to learn portion control. This is what I'm talking about, the relationships. It's a relationship that we need to get back to that's integral to our very well-being. See, it's all tied into everything. So when people say chef, executive chef, they're dealing with stereotypes. The chef at the moment, in its true sense right now, in this time, is about the gatekeeper to your mouth and to your psyche. And it has to do with working backwards, being in the present, and looking towards the future. Because when you're talking about food, it's a very personal thing. Nutrition is a very capricious animal. It's a science, it's not a science. Today it's one thing, the experts say it's something else, you know, 15 minutes later. You can pick up 10 journals about coffee. Is it good for you, is it bad for you? And you'll find 10 different versions of the same product, the same, you know, ingredient. So every individual has to be treated with absolute individuality. And we have stepped so far away from that, and we've sensationalized food to the point where everything is a fad. And yes, food can be a fad, but it also is very sacred, and in many cultures it's treated that way. We treat food in a way that it's product versus something that is for your body, which is a fuel. So there are two different aspects that we're always being confronted. We're being bombarded constantly by these messages: food as fad, the hamburger's $1, or the high-end part where it's a fad thing, it's a status thing, and we have separated people, and food has become a weapon. So you're either going to be the haves or the have-nots. There's no happy medium here. We have to get to a center point, and we have to agree about who's going to have nutrition across the board. And we spoke earlier about education in America. Well, it gets back to the food.
Yeah.
Because the school systems in America are feeding our kids garbage. And I don't know any other way to describe it. It's garbage. There are school districts in California. It's happening here in Connecticut with Amy Klofu's movement and Two Angry Moms, the movie. There's a lot of stuff going on, but still it's not where it should be. So we have to either figure out a way to correct it in a radical way that's sane, and I think the only way to do that is through education. Either we fund every school in the state of Connecticut and America equally, from Bridgeport to Greenwich, with the same exact amount of funding, and every kid gets the same exact education, and let the market determine where they go.
This is something that I'll talk about just for a second, because when I ran for state representative 2 years ago, that was one of the things I talked about taking the money, distributing it equally, well, adjusting, it's property taxes that pay for education in Connecticut towns, which is very unfortunate, because you have these high-end towns that have incredible wealth and spend incredible wealth on their educational system, and you have towns that are in cities mostly that are very poorly funded. No matter how much money you're bringing back through educational cost sharing in Connecticut, you still have the haves and the have-nots. But if you were to take funding for education and take it strictly through state taxes, taxes that we all pay as, rather than reduce the property tax as a means of paying for education, have the income tax pay for education, equalize things so that every kid in every town gets exactly the same opportunity presented to them.
Right.
Then you're going to find that the kids that you never would have imagined doing incredible things, and yet the kids that grow up in wealthy towns, they're not going to really lose anything.
You're going to create a competition based on that model that you've never seen before. We need a revolution in this country without bloodshed, and the best way to do it is to arm everybody with the equal education. So if you do this, that poor kid in an undeveloped or poverty-stricken community may have the genetic wherewithal to be the next Einstein, but they're never going to get to that level because they don't have the funding, and that is criminal. And we are killing ourselves. We're shooting ourselves in the foot because the talent out there is everywhere. It's not in Greenwich or Darien or wherever there's affluence. Talent is everywhere in America. The garage mechanic, the guy. You look at Stephen Jobs and how Hewlett Packard was, started. These guys started.
We're going to start to wrap up this episode. We're going to come back and do another episode because this is just great stuff. But I want to talk a little bit more. You mentioned the importance of relationships, and of course, you and I mean, through our friend Sal Leone we met, but we have this incredible relationship, and of course, as you know through me, that I've developed a couple of very ethereal, very wonderful relationships over the past year. One with someone that knew a lot about healthcare, came on the show, spent a lot of time on the show, and one, of course, with my good and dear friend Kristen Darling, who you know a little bit about, who, again, I've learned about these small farms because she lives on a small farm, a working farm in Richfield, and she tends to the animals. And as an aside, as I might have mentioned to you, she talks to the animals, and the animals talk back to her. And I've seen her in action, and she is just magnificent as a human being. But talk a little bit more about relationships.
Well, I think relationships begin way back when, and the development of a child's life from the womb to the grave.
Yep.
It's all about relationships and those early years. And again, it's about education, and it's nurture, versus nature. I think.
Yep.
Understanding what an object is, what went into the object, so that those early years are so important on how you learn to deal with the things that your parents give you. My father's a great example of it. He had things that he had when he was a child. He had his rattle to the day he died.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's pretty amazing that someone can hold on to an object that long. And in many cultures, the relationship to object becomes more spiritual than anything else. So, in our culture.
Okay, we're going to hold that thought because we're going to wrap it up here. This is Progressive Soup. I'm David Stevenson. Dan Lanzalotta. We're going to come back and do a second show, and we're going to tear the cover off the ball, so to speak, in baseball parlance.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. This is Progressive Soup. We'll be back through the miracle of modern television. We'll be back in a couple of seconds. Good night. For a while. So